Good morning for all those joining online. Welcome. And I'm just to remind everyone, my name is Amy Marin. I'm supporting the facilitation of Forest Legality Week 2022. Very happy to see so many people connected to the event online. And I just want to quickly share the agenda for today and tomorrow as well, and a couple additional side events. So today you'll see that the main, one second. So the main, sorry about that. There are four main panels. The first is regulating timber updates and recent developments. The second, which will start at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, is on international engagement on forest governance. The third is after a lunch break at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, updates on early warning systems for monitoring forests. And then at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, we will have timber traceability systems. Okay. So after that, we have tomorrow's agenda, which will start at the morning. So you can look at the next slide. Tomorrow morning, just like today, we're starting at 8:30 a.m. Eastern, and we have two panels tomorrow. So the first panel starts at 8:30 with policy options for commodity supply chains, looking at recent developments. And then after a break at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, we will look at addressing challenges to effective policy design and implementation, also on commodity supply chains. And tomorrow we will go until 12:10 p.m. Eastern. And then there are a couple additional side events that I will draw your attention to. So tomorrow as well, on Thursday, we have from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, Raising Ambition on Nature Crime, a new collaborative initiative. And then also on Friday from 9 to 10:30 a.m., the independent forest monitoring in the Congo Basin, taking stock. That those are the two side events remaining this week. So without further ado, a quick note for those who are avid social media users and want to be tweeting out things from the event. Just so people see it, we're using the hashtag Legality Week, and this is the information so you can find the Forest Legality Initiative account on Twitter, Forest Legality. Now I'm just going to bring us over to our first panel, and I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Bo Lee. Bo Lee is a research associate with the Forest Legality Initiative in the Forest Program at the World Resources Institute. Bo leads Forest Legality Initiative's program development and management related to China and works to develop integrated approaches to global sustainable supply chains for agricultural and forest products. Bo previously worked with the Global Restoration Initiative at WRI, accessing the motivating, enabling, and implanting factors of land restoration in Ecuador. Here, I turn you over to Bo.
Thank you, Amy, for the kind introduction. Welcome, everyone, both in the room and people online. Thank you for joining today's first session on regulatory timber updates and new developments. So today, we're very pleased to host two sessions this morning regarding to the efforts to combat illegal logging and social trade. So in this first session, you'll be hearing an overview of the implementation and development of timber legality regulations in 4 major markets, and that includes the US, the EU, Australia, and China. And this panel focuses more on the demand side measures in those markets. And a second panel this morning, which will take place after the coffee break, focus more on the international partnership and engagement side of this issue as some of you may have heard yesterday, international engagement and partnership has really been highlighted as a key issue in this area. So just since I'm moderating the first panel, I just want to note the connection here between this panel as well as the following panel. So in recent years, many consumer markets have implemented or developed laws and regulations to stop the import of illegally sourced timber and timber products coming into their markets, such as the Lacey Act Amendment here in the US, the EU timber regulation, and the FLAG-T voluntary partnership agreements, the illegal logging laws in Australia, as well as China's latest forest law that was revised in 2019. So today we feel privileged to have 4 distinguished speakers that are going to help us understand what's happening in those different markets. And those speakers are from governments, civil society organizations, as well as academia. So in terms of format of the session today, I will pass the floor to those 4 speakers that will present on their topics. And then I will ask all panelists a question before taking questions from audience both in the room as well as online. So some of the key questions when we're designing this session, we're really thinking about what are the key challenges and opportunities to strengthen the implementation and enforcement of these regulations, and how could these efforts or experience from these timber legality regulations may inform the development of policy measures to achieve deforestation-free supply chains, as we can see some markets are heading into that direction as well. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this session, Stephanie Cappa. Stephanie is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the World Wildlife Fund. Stephanie leads the policy and advocacy for WWF's strategic priorities related to forests, freshwater, and food systems. Stephanie works with key stakeholders, including the US Congress, US government agencies, the private sector, non-governmental organizations to strengthen domestic and international efforts on conservation and climate change and deliver for both people and nature. Stephanie has advanced sustainable development policy for 15 years and nonprofits in the private sector and in governments. So without further ado, let me pass to Stephanie.
Thank you, Bo, and thank you to the WRI team and the Forest Legality Week team for having me here today, and thanks to all the participants and audience members for joining this session. As Bo said, I'm Stephanie Cappa, Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the World Wildlife Fund. Many of you know WWF as a global conservation nonprofit that operates in over 100 countries around the world. So I wanted to split my presentation up into a few parts. I wanted to start out sort of giving a bit of background and an overview, where we are, where we've come, and then talk through some of the challenges and opportunities for implementing the landmark Lacey Act amendments of 2008, which is the US contribution to this space primarily. So next slide. And we can go to the slide after that as well. Okay. So a bit of background when we tee up the slide. Excellent. That's perfect. A bit of overview. I think we all know that healthy forests are indispensable for people and nature and addressing climate change. Worth noting that there is no pathway to a 1.5 degree future without halting deforestation and conversion within the decade. And we know that healthy forests are vital for biodiversity and human health, economies, and jobs. Next slide. And we know that it is essential, and it has been essential for the policy work that's been done for businesses, civil society to work together with government to achieve sort of a holistic approach to climate change and nature loss. And that is in 4 areas. One, we want to see the protection and restoration of forests. 2, we want to see the elimination of deforestation, degradation, conversion. 3, halting the illegal timber trade, and we'll of course talk about that much more. And 4, promoting sustainable livelihoods and the recognition of rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And so we really see those 4 sort of pillars reinforcing work around healthy forests that can deliver for climate and nature and people. And I'll say a note on the private sector engagement piece based on WWF's own experience, that really it has been and continues to be a critical element. And I wanted to lift up in particular WWF's longstanding work around the Global Forest and Trade Network program that has since been relaunched as our Forest Forward program, working with US companies that want to show leadership on forests through both responsible sourcing and investing in nature-based solutions that benefit local communities and Indigenous peoples. And we really see this as an essential piece of the puzzle. And complementing this is the essential role of policy and government action. And so I want to turn now to focusing in on the illegal timber trade sort of piece of the puzzle, and in particular, start to discuss how to fully utilize the Lacey Act amendments of 2008 as a really essential policy lever in this space. So for scene setting, I think folks know illegal logging and associated trade continues to be a significant global challenge. Recently was ranked the 3rd largest global transnational crime after counterfeiting and drug trafficking, generating between $50 and $150 billion per year, so quite sizable. The links to corruption are also significant, with recent estimates of forestry-related corruption costing governments approximately $29 billion annually. And of course, I noted the significant impacts that illegal logging has on some of the world's most biologically diverse and vulnerable forests, climate change, harms to local communities, as well as harming business and those engaged in the legal forest products trade through the significant depressing of world timber prices. And I think it's worth really underscoring that left unaddressed, the persistent illegality that we are seeing really undermines all conservation and climate efforts. And so the legality piece is really an essential piece of this puzzle to address. Next slide. So turning now to the Lacey Act amendments of 2008, this is really the landmark legislation that the United States adopted 14 years ago, when the US Congress passed and President Bush signed into law the first ever ban on trafficking of products containing illegally sourced wood. And very significant as a demand side measure, United States, the world's largest consumer of forest products, taking this step. So it demonstrated not only significant action for the US market, but also was an important step forward for signaling the establishment of a new global norm around supply chain traceability, transparency, and accountability, really linked to legislative action. Over the course of the last 14 years, we've seen some enforcement of the Lacey Act amendments of 2008. The most notable case was in 2015, when there was the first ever felony conviction related to trade in illegal lumber. And there has been some analysis writ large of the effectiveness of the amendments in addressing the flow of illegal timber into the US. With the most recent study that I'm aware of, pointing to the act as contributing to a decrease of 32 to 44% of illegal timber into the US. So quite a sizable shift in terms of imports into the US and really reducing this flow of illegal timber. But challenges, of course, remain. And I think there are significant opportunities to advance the implementation and effectiveness of the law. So next slide. I think there's one before this. So the amendment, as I noted, has demonstrated its potential for impact. Yet, we have seen ongoing delays in the full phase-in of key elements of the law, and enforcement efforts that could really be ramped up over the coming months and years. And I'll point to a few data points. I think this is on the last slide. One is that in 2019, WWF, WRI, and the US Forest Service conducted a study sampling wood products on the US market. And this testing revealed that over half of the products that were surveyed had incorrect species claims, suggesting, I think, a troubling level of incorrect labeling of products on the US market. So either obfuscation or intentional inaccurate claims about what wood species, what plant species are in the products that we use each day. So I think points to a gap or an opportunity for additional focusing in. And this sample was conducted where wood product species information was reported, was available. I think another key piece of the puzzle is the Lacey Act declaration requirement, where importers are required to file species and country of origin information with US officials. This requirement only applies to, as of our most recent analysis, 42% of the value of wood products imported into the US. And so building out from that calculation, that still leaves $45 billion of wood and plant product imports each year that are subject to the prohibition in the Lacey Act, uncovered by the declaration requirement, which really is a key tool for compliance and enforcement by the US government. And I think this continues to be quite a major area for further action. And I will also say that of the categories that have yet to be phased in, furniture, pulp, and paper are key categories that are largely uncovered by the declaration requirement to date. So we see that as a key area to address. So next slide, please. Taking stock of where we have come over the last 14 years with Lacey Act implementation and enforcement and funding, a number of partners across industry and the environmental sector and the labor community have long supported the enactment and implementation of the Lacey Act amendments, and came together at the start of this year to release recommendations. Can you go to the previous slide that has the coalition members? Because I think it's important to show really the breadth, excellent, this is it, the breadth of this coalition here, and you can see all the names. It would take too long to read these aloud, but really issued recommendations for key areas that where we could partner, I think, more effectively and better with the US government on full utilization of the Lacey Act amendments. And so I will now touch base quickly on the 4 overarching sort of areas of opportunity here. So next slide. Great. Okay, so the 4 areas briefly is one, I think the amendments would benefit significantly from an influx of political will and a recommitment to the importance of addressing the illegal timber trade. And so, a high level signal of support around the intent for the US government to halt illegal timber products into the US, and specifically prioritizing implementation, compliance, enforcement of the Lacey Act amendments of 2008 specifically would be an undeniable advancement in this space and really give this issue the central attention that it needs. I think one of the challenges for implementing the Lacey Act has been the complexity of the agencies involved in this, and we could talk a bit more about that. And if there are questions, we can discuss more later. The second recommendation is around the import declaration, and this falls within the jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so to date, we have seen a significant number of product categories phased in. We need to see that move over the finish line for the amendments to be fully implemented in this key way. Third recommendation is for agencies and Congress to prioritize the amendments in terms of funding and staffing, training, and technology deployment. And fourth is the sort of the engagement piece. And looking to build on the current successes that we've seen over the past 14 years in terms of engagement with producer countries, other markets, private sector, civil society, and really redoubling that engagement around Lacey Act compliance and enforcement. Okay, so to go a bit further into each of these, next slide. I'll talk quickly about the political will piece that I think is so essential. It was really essential to the Lacey Act's enactment back in 2008, a high level signal of support and from President Bush at the time and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, really bipartisan, high-level support for addressing the illegal timber trade, and returning to this type of expression of political will, I think, is really required to move the needle quickly and comprehensively as we need to see the Lacey Act amendments really live up to their potential. So we've seen, some very well and positive commitments from this administration in the past year alone, with the Glasgow Leaders Pledge last year at the Climate COP, the U.S. plan on circular forests and the $9 billion commitment of U.S. government funding alongside that, the President's Earth Day executive order around addressing commodity-driven deforestation, and even at UNGA this year, the U.S. sign on to the Forest and Climate Leaders Group. And my understanding this time at the Climate COP in just a few weeks. So I think all of these and other areas really show the leadership that understands the connection between forests and climate and role that the US can play to address global deforestation. And I think it will be critical from this point onward to ensure that the Lacey amendments are brought in as a critical tool to advance many of these commitments and some others. And that we now need to move from the high level commitments that we have seen into implementation, and that the Lacey amendments and moving forward, addressing some of these implementation gaps or opportunities for deepening really significant existing bodies of work will play a key role in advancing these overarching commitments. So I see Lacey as being a key tool that the administration and the US government has at its disposal right now that can be leveraged to meet this variety of high level political commitments already made. So next slide is zeroing in a bit more on USDA's role in this. It really is a critical one. And through the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, APHIS, I think we are keen to work with the partners that I noted signed on to the set of recommendations to really move forward on finalizing the phase-in of the plant declaration requirement for the remaining plant product categories that are covered by the Lacey Act amendments. And this original set of recommendations, when it was issued at the start of this year, this broad stakeholder community came together and said, we think it is urgent and feasible to phase in all of these outstanding product categories by the end of 2022. And I think that really, and it's October, don't think that's going to happen in the next couple of months. But I think that really underscores the seriousness with which industry, the environment, and the labor communities are who participated in this letter are really speaking with one voice, that this remains an implementation priority, and one that really is essential to meeting the objectives of the law. Next slide. This is a bit of a weighty one, a bit of a weighty recommendation around and sort of reflection on, again, 14 years of the amendments being on the book, that I think there is a need to renew the prioritization of funding, of staffing, training, and technology deployment around Lacey Act amendment implementation. And so a deeper dive in this, let's see, slide below that, or a couple slides back. There we go, perfect. Deeper dive implementation. Perfect. Okay, so this is a deeper dive into the third sort of insight and recommendation around the need to fund and staff Lacey Act implementation. One, we know that oversight and funding and coordination from both the administration and Congress with civil society and the private sector are really necessary to reinforce the shift.
Sorry, Stephanie, this is Paul here. Just wanted to let you know, I think since in the interest of time, if you could kind of wrap up in a minute or two, because that would be great. Thank you.
That's great. I am almost to the end. All right. So here, I think the bottom line is we want to see agencies able to routinely flag shipments for greater scrutiny, generating action that leads to enforcement and improved due care practices. So that would go a long way, this resourcing and capacity. Next slide. Again, very quickly, I touched on the importance of the US government redoubling engagement and collaboration with the producer and consumer countries. I think this also ties in with the session tomorrow morning around options for due diligence sort of policy approaches. And then the last slide, again, sort of circling back to opportunities to advance Lacey Act implementation and enforcement through these major commitments and moments that we see of opportunity with this administration and with this Congress. And so just a few of them here. And I hope we'll see more and look forward to working with many of you in the room and around the virtual table on this moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the updates about the Lacey Act, as well as sharing a very comprehensive and insightful set of recommendations to fully utilize the law. So now let's turn to Europe. It's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, who is also joining us remotely today, Helge Zeitler. Helge is the deputy head of the unit in the European Commission of Environment Development, which leads on the Commission's proposal for regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. She's been in that function since September 2021. And before her current posting, Helge served 3 years at the EU's mission to the UN in New York as lead on environment, climate, and energy files. And prior to that, she was the deputy head of the unit for bilateral and multilateral environmental cooperation. And Helge is a lawyer by training and has been working on international affairs since 2002. And without further ado, let me pass forward to Helge.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon from Brussels. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you in DC. And thank you again for inviting me to join you at this event. It is a very exciting year in the EU on deforestation. We have a lot of things happening, a lot of very active legislative developments, as you may have heard. So I think this is a great opportunity to give you an update on where things are and also on how our new approach to deforestation is really coming in a kind of fluid development from the EU timber regulations. So I would like to start with a little history of the EU timber regulation, just to refresh everyone's memory. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Could you move the slide? Thanks. Yes, so the EU timber regulation has been in application since 2013, so almost 10 years. It was quite an innovative piece of legislation at the time because it introduced the due diligence approach that at the time wasn't used a lot in EU legislation. It covers timber and timber products. It has a due diligence obligation regarding the legality of harvest. And it aims to ensure traceability of the supply chain with 3 pillars: the access to information, a risk assessment, and risk mitigation. And we had an exception from this due diligence obligation if timber comes covered with a flagged license or with a CITES permit. So flagged license achieved through a voluntary partnership agreement would have kind of a green lane into the EU market. So this system has been enforced and continues to be enforced for almost 10 years now. And in 2020, next slide, please, we started what we call in the EU a fitness check, so to see about strengths and weaknesses of this legislation. And what were some of the main findings for the EUTR were on the positive side that there was really a significant improvement in awareness and transparency of information regarding timber and timber product supply chains. And what was also very important for us was to see that the due diligence requirement is really implementable, including for SMEs, because that is an argument that we often hear. These rules are all too complicated for small and medium-sized enterprises, and that is not what we found in our fitness check. This is possible, and it is being done. The fitness check, however, also identified a number of shortcomings, because actually exports from countries where we knew there was a high level of illegal logging activity actually grew. We also, after many years, only have one partner country with, TR implementation also varied significantly between member states. That is, of course, a particular challenge in the EU, because we do legislation at EU level, but then implementation depends very much on member states. It's their job. And of course, here capacities and level of enforcement varied quite a bit. We also noted challenges for operators to validate information. We also noted that for some it was still challenging, including in the competent authorities, to understand how they can check on due diligence and whether this has been complied with. And there were also quite a number of challenges to go to court and to bring successful cases about inadequate due diligence. So this was a finding that led us to the conclusion that we need to improve our system if it comes to the legality. But at the same time, of course, we noted the trends in deforestation. And when we look, for example, at forest trends, you see the significant percentage of deforestation that is actually legal. So it depends from country to country, but in many countries, the percentages of what is legal deforestation driven by land conversion is very high. So that showed to us very much the limits of our approach that focuses only on legality. In particular, also because you can also see in some cases an incentive to legalize activities, to take very destructive harvesting activities out of the scope of any legality check. So that was why we in 2019 took a more comprehensive approach with what we call a communication, which is a policy strategy on addressing global deforestation in a more encompassing manner. Next slide, please. But before I explain the new approach, to come back also to the element of the voluntary partnership agreements. So these are trade agreements, looking in particular at the timber trade. And as I said before, if those voluntary partnership agreements lead to licenses, so-called flagged licenses, those have a direct entry into the EU market, and operators that want to import such flagged licensed timber don't need to undergo due diligence. So here again, we did an evaluation. We found, again, good things and not so good things. On the positive side, significant improvements on forest governance in many partner countries. In particular, and that's a very important point, of course, the multi-stakeholder dialogues around forest governance have promoted the inclusion of civil society into decision-making processes around forest governance. But there were also really quite significant shortcomings that were identified. A very important one, key trading partners of the EU did not show an interest in concluding such agreements. So that means by today, only a very small share of the timber and timber product market is actually covered by voluntary partnership agreements, which obviously addresses or is a challenge for their impact. Only one partner country, Indonesia, has, after 15 years of these negotiations, an operating licensing system in place. Some others are close, but still, 15 years later, only one country. VPA negotiations are very long, very complex, and very resource intense. And we could not find clear evidence of their impact in terms of stopping illegal timber from being placed on the EU market. So all of this, again, brought us to the conclusion that also in that context, we need to take a different approach and do something more comprehensive. Next slide, please. So based on this fitness check and the evaluations, we did an impact assessment looking at different options. We had a huge public consultation. It was the second most popular in EU history, 1.2 million respondents. We also collected feedback through a multi-stakeholder platform where also quite a range of third countries, so producer countries and other consumer countries were represented, but also civil society and industry. And yeah, based on that, we launched a proposal for a new regulation, so a new law that is directly applicable. The proposal was adopted by the Commission last year in November. And this year we've actually seen great progress. So the member state governments who meet in the Council adopted already their general approach on this proposal in June. We also had a report from the European Parliament with a lot of amendments for the proposal in September. And what we are seeing now at the moment are negotiations between these co-legislators, so the representatives of the governments of the member states and the European Parliament, aiming at a final text. And we are still optimistic that this could even be achieved before the end of this year, if not early next year. So this has been an incredibly speedy process for EU legislation. And I think that also shows how big the commitment is at political level, both in the Parliament, in the member states, and also that yeah, there's a very strong feeling about the urgency of doing this and of having a more ambitious approach because of the continued dramatic rate of deforestation worldwide. So there is a strong feeling of the co-legislators that this must move fast. We can't afford to wait longer. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, the main objective of the legislation is to minimize the EU's contribution to deforestation and forest degradation worldwide. Our contribution in terms of a huge consumer market where we import products that were produced on land recently deforested. And I come to the scope in a minute. So we want to minimize the risk that products coming from deforestation associated supply chains to the EU market. And at the same time, we also want to really boost demand for those products who are produced in a deforestation-free way. So it's also meant really as an incentive for those who have clean and deforestation-free supply chains. Next slide, please. So the proposal goes beyond timber. It covers 6 commodities. You see them here: palm oil, soy, wood, cattle, cocoa, and coffee, and a range of derived products. This is still up for discussion whether more commodities should be added, but those were the ones proposed by the Commission. The regulation, and that is very important, applies both to domestically produced products and to imported commodities and products. So really a non-discriminatory approach. We have a cutoff date. The Commission proposed end of 2020, because this is the moment when under the SDGs, the world had committed to halt deforestation. We did not achieve that, but I think that was a moment when there was an international consensus at that time there shouldn't have been more deforestation. So the cutoff date means that communities are not allowed to enter into the market if produced on land subject to deforestation after that date. And we really try to use internationally used definitions whenever possible in our proposal. Next slide, please. So the main approach is, again, mandatory due diligence for all operators that place products on the EU market or export them from the EU. But we have reinforced the strict traceability, linking the commodity to the plot of land. So the idea is you have to provide the geolocation of the plot of land where the commodity was produced. And then this information and others need to be passed on throughout the supply chain. And there needs to be, by those placing it on the market, there needs to be a due diligence statement. This is then submitted to a newly set up information system, which helps enforcement afterwards, because this is then available information for the authorities. We will have a benchmarking system that allows to assign risk to countries depending on the level of deforestation, low, standard, and high. And we've tried to have a bit more harmonized approach to the enforcement in the member states with a common minimum level of inspections, for example. And a point that was mentioned before by the speaker, cooperation with partner countries, both on the producer and on the consumer side, is also a very central element. Next, please. So again, to just focus on a couple of improvements compared to the EU timber regulation. So not looking so much that we broaden the approach, but really trying to see also where we learned lessons from what has been challenging under the EUTR. So we tried, as I said before, to use more internationally agreed and more precise definitions. We've also made the description of the obligations more precise. The due diligence statement and the submission to this common information system should help authorities who have to control the compliance, because they immediately have access to the information that was used by the operators when they performed the due diligence. We have clearer defined obligations for competent authorities, and these measures to have some minimum enforcement standards throughout the EU. And we have a whole chapter dedicated to the interplay between competent authorities and customs, with a duty of cooperation that was a challenge also in the past, or continues to be one under the EU timber regulation. Next, please. So I can answer or go into a bit more detail if there are questions. There are a lot of elements to this. It's a complex legislation. It's an ambitious one. We do believe, I don't need to repeat the figures, that through this approach we can help save a number of a quite significant number of hectares of forest from EU-driven deforestation, forest degradation. And by that, obviously also reduce our CO2 footprint through our consumption. We also believe that the transparency of supply chains will benefit also other consumer markets, even if their requirements will differ a little bit, but we do keep the legality requirement. We just made it a bit tighter. And we added the deforestation-free requirement. And if you have transparency of supply chains with these two criteria in mind, that is, from our perspective, really something that can help far beyond the EU imports or exports, but really help with regard to all those who want to reduce the consumption of deforestation-related products. We know we are front runners with this approach, and we also know that many others are watching carefully, including in many other major consumer markets. So we are very determined to make this work and to show that this can work. And I think it's this strong political will that hopefully will get us to a success and to entry into force of this very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Helge, for sharing the main findings from the Commission on the fitness check of EUTR and the FLEGT regulations, and also sharing the latest information regarding the proposed regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. Next, we're gonna move to Australia. As some of you have seen that Australia completed the sunsetting review of its Illegal Logging Prohibition Act 2012 and highlight a few areas for future reform. So today we're delighted to have Jesse Mahoney from the Embassy of Australia to the United States here with us in person today. Jesse is the Counselor of Agriculture at the Embassy here in Washington, D.C. And he works across a full breadth of Australia's agriculture interests to promote the nation's policies, to advance and promote market access interests, and maintain and grow the trade relationship with the United States. Additionally, Jesse is the 2022 chairperson of the Council of the International Tropical Timber Organization, also known as ITTO. And before coming to Washington, Jesse was the Director of International Forest Policy at the now Department of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Forestry in the Australian government, where he was responsible for leading the regulatory elements of Australia's illegal logging laws, as well as Australia's bilateral and multilateral forest engagement. And Jesse, thank you.
Let me just. Let me just keep your presentation for you. Okay, there we go. And I just need to share it to the room. There you go. So now it was acting up a little bit. So
I'll just use the arrows.
that's what I thought was going to work.
Oh,
But if you just leave the mouse there and you hit this one, it should work. Okay. Jeez, I'm right here.
good morning, all. My name's Jesse Mahoney, and I work here in DC at the Australian Embassy. It's great to be here with you all. In the interest of time, I'm going to try and streamline through this presentation, but it's got a lot of detail in it. Today, I'm here just to quickly touch on what Australia is doing with its illegal logging laws. It's been 10 years since we introduced them. It's 10 birthdays in 42 days, which is kind of cool. And then some of those reforms that we're going to do with it. So illegal logging, we're not immune to it in Australia. We do have instances of it occurring in Australia with some high value species such as sandalwood, but our biggest exposure is in the international front. We have increasing numbers of imports of timber and timber products. So that's why we took action on it well over a decade ago. It took a long time to get to the point of our legislation. The figure here says we're exposed to about $350 million of imports of illegal timber each year. That is on an old study, and my department's currently investing in a new piece of research to find out what our exposure is today, because I think that figure is from about 15 years ago. A lot of this data is out of date on exposures, which is a shame. So our laws have two components. There's the high level prohibition, which has a really high bar, and that says it's illegal to bring the product into Australia. But the real grunt work is done through a regulation that sits under it, which is the due diligence arrangements, really similar to what the EU do with the EUTR. So I'm not going to explain any more than that. But just to say that we regulate just over $5 billion US a year of trade, and about 20,000 entities. Cool. So over the years, we've seen a lot of the same issues that Helge touched on from their fitness check. We've had issues with compliance and enforcement, really high bars, thresholds to meet. The supply chains are complex. And it's really difficult for people to interpret how the legislation works. So we deal with a lot of importers or organizations that English is not their first language, and to engage in complex legislation is difficult for them. We try and make it easy, but it's really not. We have limited mechanisms to obtain information. So a lot of it's been quite manual throughout the process. When the product's brought into Australia, we don't automatically grab their due diligence information. We have to go out and get it from them. We've seen issues of that sort of nature with a range of pieces of legislation. It's just simply something we didn't think about at the time. It's hard to reach those smaller businesses that they might bring in 5 consignments a year, might be high value, but they're not going to be up to date with the laws on what they need to do if they're only bringing in 5 times a year and their main business is in something else. So these laws touch on tea bags, for example. Their business is in food. The business is not the tea bag itself. That's not to say we haven't done our compliance activities, but we're seeing all of those issues occur throughout, and it's really difficult to build that case that they're knowingly, recklessly, and intentionally undertaking an illegal activity. So that brings me to what we're doing here today with our laws. And in Australia, we set in place, would have been just over a decade ago, an arrangement where all of our regulations, unless it's really high profile, sunsets after 10 years. And that's so that we can make sure it's fit for purpose. We can review it and we can remake the regulation. We can, as it is, we can improve it or we can delete it. If it's not needed anymore, why have it? With our legal logging regulation, full intention that we will remake that. It will continue to exist. It's got bipartisan support across both of our major political parties. We've just had a government change in Australia in May, and both parties were in full support of this review. So it is looking good. The regulation is due to sunset on the 1st of April next year. So we started this sunsetting review about 2 years ago. At this stage, we're not going to complete this review by the 1st of April next year. COVID and a whole range of other issues have come up in that time, particularly our change of government. So we're looking to extend our sunsetting date by 2 years to give us a little bit more time to work through what we need to do. And it's looking likely that we're not just going to make changes to our regulation, but we'll also beef up our act. We'll make some changes in there that are really important to make sure the regulation functions. So aside from all of the issues that we found with our regulation, that Helge touched on really well, same applies to us. We came up with a list of the reforms that we were looking at considering, detailed on the screen here. But the main one was around getting information upfront at the time of import, requiring all importers of regulated timber products to put their due diligence assessments in the system to get information for the first time at the time of import around what the species is and the origin. And that really helps us do better targeting of high-risk imports and see who are the repeat offenders in not providing sufficient information. Helps us build a longer-term case as well. Looking at things like adding the ability to impose injunctions and enforceable undertakings, and then also opportunities to reduce the burden. We don't want to make businesses' lives easier. If it's easier for them to comply, they're gonna follow. So that's what we're really looking to do. And then improvements and things like definitions to really tighten up some of those issues that the European Union is looking to tighten up with their deforestation piece. Are the definitions clear? Do they hit international standards? Is it repeatable across multiple instruments? And how we brought this all about was initially through international engagement. The laws that we implemented and the EU and the US implemented over a decade ago, they're all novel. They had a lot of holes in them, a lot of gaps. And that international engagement through scientists, other governments, bodies like Apex Experts Group on Illegal Logging and Associated Trade have been really crucial in understanding those gaps, seeing those responses that others are taking, and then synthesizing something that actually can be better implemented. And hopefully we'll benefit from those. So there was a lot of desktop behind the scenes work for our sunsetting review. The major public facing elements, though, were in the middle of last year. We undertook a public consultation seeking written submissions. And we also undertook webinars so that we could put out there the information that we'd seen on our regulations and what some of those reforms were. And that also gave people the opportunity to say, well, look at the direction this is going. Do we really need to provide a lengthy submission? So in the end, we got 24 full-length written submissions with ideas on our proposals. We had 30 survey submissions, which were simple yes, no, I agree, I don't agree with some of our reforms. And thankfully, a lot of them have been in lockstep. We've seen broad support for most of those reforms that we've said. Some parties have said, well, slow down, don't make sure you're not making it too easy for some of those potentially lower risk products. We just want to make sure that the laws are consistently applied. All of that information is online about those submissions, the ones that they didn't say they needed to be private. So the link is on the screen. But some of the core things that we saw in there was, yes, get the information up front. Yes, using Timber ID testing technologies is really good. That's going to help us not just with our illegal logging messaging, but also selling our products into the market. Consumers love buying tables that they know what the product is. And just generally support. The one thing that we did test with the regulated community and that didn't receive as much support initially is increases to our range of regulated products. So we looked at musical instruments, we looked at printed articles. Printed articles is an odd one in our system. So we regulate imports of paper. We don't regulate books. But domestically, a domestic processor has to check the legality of the timber that's going into books in Australia. So there's a bit of a gap there. It doesn't mean the support's not there for those products. It's just that we need to do more targeted engagement over the coming years. So we've parked it for now, but it is something that we will revisit because we know other economies are looking at those sorts of reforms. So expect that we'll be drafting and putting a bill before Parliament in the next 12 months or so. We will be undertaking some further consultations on this and reworking provisions and penalties to improve enforceability. So this applies to our Act. So that's the main piece of work that's the next 12 months is you'll see a bill before our Parliament that'll all be public. And then while we're doing that, we're also going to be doing some preliminary work on timber testing technologies. So we've put some money into some work on that front, and we'll be trialing a range of technologies, which I'll touch on in a second. Overall, the complete package of work will be completed by around April 1st, 2025. So timber testing technology is going to be a foundational part of what we do with logging forward, designed to help us get some clearer evidence when a breach has been undertaken under our laws. It's to help support education within our regulated community, but also consumers of these products, consumers being not just you as an everyday consumer in a store, but also at the business level, the ones who are importing the product to sell, and basically as a tool to promote legal trade as well, like the carrot of if you know what it is, you know where it's from, you might be more inclined to buy that product. So we're looking at a range of different technologies. 5 years ago, we were really heavily focused on DNA, but we've now realized that there's a full suite of tools that we can use. Wood anatomy analysis, digital mass spectrometry, stable isotope testing, etc. So we're going to be testing a range of technologies and determining what's fit for purpose under certain use scenarios. A lot of that work's already been done internationally, so we'll be piggybacking on that. So it reduces our workload and it just adds to a bigger body of evidence. Like Stephanie mentioned earlier, the 2019 study in the US around using some of these technologies to test products in the marketplace, we also found the same thing. We found about 40% of products were not what they said they were. So under our laws, we can't actually test at the border. So we just went into a range of hardware stores like a Home Depot or a furniture store, flooring stores took samples and just tested them. 40% came back as not what they said they were. Things like teak came back as rubber wood. You can tell that by a visual check, but the average consumer won't know. So that was an interesting result. And it basically said, well, we need to focus a little bit more on this. So that's what we're doing. So that's over the next 12 to 18 months. And these trials will support final elements in our bill around what we need to do to line up a process that gets a prosecution if we find the tech says that it's an illegal product or it's not what it was meant to be. So it's a piece of work that will inform that. Cool. Let's just skip past that. Longer term on the tech side, as I said, this is about building an international effort, community of practice around this sort of thing. Testing is expensive. We can learn lessons from others. Others can learn lessons from us. So it's really going to be about how we can plug into existing databases to get knowledge out of those, but also where the gaps exist for our market and we can contribute into those databases as well. So it's a full information exchange. That's why things like World Forest ID are really important to this effort. It minimizes the cost for us because it's hard to get new funding for these sorts of things. So where we can piggyback is really helpful. And we're hoping to also use this as an opportunity to build awareness in our lab community that there is a broader stream of work here that they could also be contributing to. So what we can do as a government to support private labs in getting accredited for these sorts of things to do work for both the Australian government, but also businesses. We're looking top end of town that might be interested, like Bunnings, who are like Home Depot here, or whether IKEA want to buy into this sort of thing, just to give these facilities the opportunity to participate in a global network and support these. And that's all with a message of saying, we think the testing technology has a chance to reduce the regulatory burden on a lot of businesses. So if we see a lot more effort in the system in verifying claims through tech rather than just doing a due diligence desktop assessment, we can build ticks of approval around certain businesses or certain product lines, and we can say, no, we're not gonna focus on you today. We'll focus on you again in a year and a half, 2 years time, but we trust you right now, and we can focus on the more problematic areas. So whether this track of work comes to fruition in our regulation is another question. Right now, this type of reform would not be considered in our regulation. It's too significant, and we don't know if the tech stands up in our regulatory framework, but it's something that we can look at again in another 3 or 4 years' time. So right now, our reforms, which will start to come to more public visibility in the next year, will focus on data collection and to buy into the system, and then longer term, how we can streamline it a bit more and make it a bit easier. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot more information in those slides, and apologies for running through it very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, for the very useful updates about the Australian ethical logging laws, as well as the interesting work you just mentioned on timber testing technologies. So last but not least, we're gonna look into the development of regulations in China. As you know, China revised its forest law in late 2019 and included an article on timber legality. And this year, the government published a draft implementation regulation of the law. And to help us understand all of this, I'm delighted to introduce Sheng Sun from Vermont Law School. If I could invite Sheng to join us front here. So Sheng is the director of Law Lab for International Sustainable Development, a research institute at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Sheng's work focuses on regulatory issues related to transnational environmental and economic governance. And before joining Vermont Law School in 2015, Sheng was a vice president of a Beijing-based law and consulting firm specialized in international trade and investment. And before that, he worked for the Philippine government and served from 2008 to 2012 as its mainland China marketing officer. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Sheng.
Okay, thank you, Bo. Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you, Bo, for that kind of introduction. I would just jump right into the topic. So first, some clarification. I do not work for the Chinese government or the Chinese Forest Authority. So I actually conduct research and also teach here in the United States from Vermont at Vermont Law School. So what I can offer today is basically a legal analysis of the current situations of the Chinese timber legality regulation. And also looking to the future, I want to briefly mention some of the shift in a more general policy landscape that might be relevant to the development of the regulatory regime. So as Bo has mentioned, it all started in 2019. So toward the end of that year, China revised its forest law. And in this revision, it actually include a very specific article, Article 65, which is banning the purchase, the process, and also the transportation of illegally sourced timber. So in theory, actually, the law took effect in July 2020, but in practice, for nationwide implementation and enforcement of this law, it was actually pending upon a very important what we call implementation regulation coming from the State Council. So this is where things become a little bit confusing, especially for international observers. So moving fast forward to the July of this year, 2022, when the draft of this implementation regulation come out from the State Council, the international observer couldn't find anything related to Article 65. And there's also no mention of timber legality or related issue. So a lot of the observers become quite worried, and some say, okay, the law might have been eliminated by this regulation. So what has really happened? Well, believe it or not, even in China, it's actually not that easy to eliminate a piece of law from what has been enacted by the Congress. So I think here the problem is really some confusion about this very unique Chinese legal instrument, what we call the implementation regulation. I think some of the international observers may have confused it with other legal concepts, like in the EU you have implementing regulation, but it's actually totally different things. So in China, this implementation regulation, it is used for giving more details and specifics, usually when the language of the article in the law is vague, or sometimes it's too general. So to enforce the law, you would need more details from the State Council. So you can see it is not actually legislative in nature. So it is not making any new law or eliminating any law. And it is also not making new regulations. It is actually interpretive in nature. So it only gives specifics and the details if it is necessary. So I can give you another example here. So in this chart, you can see on the left side of the chart is the chapter 2 of the Chinese forest law. So this whole chapter is talking about forest right issue. So it's a very important issue. And it has actually 9 different articles explaining what kind of right framework the legislators want to establish. But on the right side of the table, you can see it's the implementation regulation. We only have 2 articles in this section, which is actually on a very specific terminology, what we call the national key forest region. So to explain what do they mean by this term, and also which agency or which department of the agency would be in charge of designating this region. So clear enough, I think the end result is that Article 65 remains in the law of the land. So it's not eliminated. Since there's no specific, interpretation from the State Council at this stage, so moving forward, the forestry authority in China, that is the National Forest and Grassland Administration, NFGA, they would have the legal mandate to enforce the law and implement the law as it is worded in the original language. So moving forward, when it comes to rulemaking efforts, the agency can actually take 2 different, ways. One approach is to use, administrative or what we call departmental rules. So that is essentially a piece of regulation. So to make that regulation, of course, the regulation has to be based on Article 65, but then you have to go through the protocols or the procedures that is required by the legislative law in China. So you have to go through, for example, public notice and a comment, right? The other approach they can use is actually to use administrative interpretation, which is again still mandatory, but you don't have to go through a lot of the protocol requirement. You don't have to go through public notice and comment, for example. When it comes to enforcement, it's actually going to be a little bit more complex. So if it is non-criminal, then the first tier authority, that is at the central level, the NFGA, and at the local level, the local and the provincial forest bureaus. So they will be in charge of enforcing this law. But if there are activities involved, then the Ministry of Public Security, and also at the local and the provincial level, the public security bureaus there, they will be involved in investigating the case and collecting the evidence. And then they will bring the case to the public procurator, and the procurator will decide whether they will bring the case to the court or not. And then if the case is delivered to the court, then the judge will adjudicate the case and make decision accordingly. So here the enforcement will run parallel between the first three forces, first three agencies, and also the system of public security, procurator, and the court. For my next two slides, I do want to zoom out a little bit, talk beyond Article 65. And I want to mention some of the, I think, relevant recent shift in a more general policy landscape in China that might be relevant to the further development of this regulatory regime. So here, a major policy documents I want to talk about is actually coming from the Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM. It's the ministry's 14th five-year plan. So 14th five-year plan is like many of the other five-year plans in China, is a major and foundational policy documents for this Ministry of Commerce to lay out its policy objective for the next 5 years. So from 2021 to 2025. So in this 5-year plan, the Ministry of Commerce actually set up a grand vision. I think they're very ambitious this year because this 5-year actually is a very important time because it's right behind, right after the 20th People's Party's Congress. So they actually put up a vision for 2035. And I won't mention all the visions, but I think here there's some highlights we might want to pay attention to. So they do mention that they intend to make positive progress on green and low carbon trade, and also want to maintain the legalities and compliance of international trade. So that I think is all relevant to timber legality regulation. But of course, this is from MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce. And then they also mentioned that they want the Chinese government to make more contribution to international economic governance and its reform. So to achieve this, grand strategy or, objectives, they have laid out 10 what they call major tasks. So that is the way they achieve those goals. So here for major task number 4, they mentioned about trade digitalization. I think we have heard a lot of things about technologies, about traceabilities, just in the previous presentations. Here in China also, I think a lot of my colleagues here in the United States, they're just amazed by how China can actually use those app to trace the spread of COVID, and they're just thinking if that can be applied also to the timber legality regulation. Actually, there is a very positive possibility for that, because right now in China, because it's a manufacturing hub, a lot of the manufacturers, especially the small and the medium-sized companies, they're actually relying very heavily on internet app, those digitalized tools to source their timber and also to find their customers. So if those tools can be actually utilized for administrative purpose or for regulatory purpose, then that will significantly increase the efficiencies of the regulation. So here they mentioned about they want to actually pilot internet platform, essentially apps, to achieve that goals. And they also wanted to make sure that the import and export license will go paperless. So that is the customer, right? So they will have the electronic system, which will be able to manage the importations and exportations more efficiently. So I think that is all positive for timber legality administration. And then there is major task number 5, and it talks about building this green trade system. So it's essentially using a set of governmental initiated tools, such as traceability tools, monitoring tools, and using platform and using also index and criteria to promote green and low carbon trade. So what do they mean by green and low carbon trade? So there's a few criteria here. First, of course, improve your industrial practice, right? So for example, sourcing your material responsibly, and also optimize your energy usage, right? So use low carbon energy, use sustainable energy, green energy. And also they promote a green and innovative production process. So this is PPM, production process and methodology, which is not traditionally getting a lot of attention when countries get into trade agreement, but they want to bring this issue up and pay more attention to this. And also finally, very importantly, and related to timber legality, I think directly, is this requirement to use green raw material. So this is green and low carbon trade. And finally, major task number 10, they mentioned about they want to create a good environment for Chinese, trade. So good environment, I guess, is basically, a friendly environment. So here, I think relevant maybe to the audience today is that they mentioned specifically that they want to maintain this economic and trade communication with the US government at all levels, and also with the US business communities to promote bilateral trade and investment cooperations. So you might have heard about this tension between these two countries. But the reason for me to put this here is just to show you that at least at the agency level, when it comes to the Chinese trade and commerce policy, the Ministry of Commerce remains open-minded, and they want to increase the international collaborations on certain issues so that they can create a more friendly trade environment for the Chinese commerce. So that is, I think, all my presentation today, and I'll just transfer back to Bo.
Well, thank you, Sheng, for saving us some time. So I realize that we're over time already, but I just confirmed with our facilitators that we could extend this session for another 5 minutes. So I do want to make sure that both the audience in the room and audience online have opportunity to ask a few questions. So maybe
These are a couple summarized questions
Okay.
that came up from online.
Mhm. So we do have 2 questions summarized online. I will ask them to the panel first, and anyone here in the room, please think about your question. We're gonna take them, ask them together, and ask the panelists to respond. So the first question is, can you clarify the resources available for implementation and enforcement? Did you do an assessment? I assume this is for all panelists, or? Oh, okay. So, okay. Let me repeat the question. The question is for Helge. Could you please clarify the resources available for implementation or enforcement? Did you do a need assessment? The second question is on the full traceability.
Is around how to trace when they're mixed.
Okay. The second question is also for Helge. Is I think the audience were interested in learning more about the full traceability for products that may require mixing input in their manufacturing process. Let me take 2 more from the room.
Claudia Romero, University of Florida. I have a bunch of questions, but let me just ask one for Jesse from Australia. Seems that we've been talking for a long time about what illegal logging is, and I wonder why do we need to continue, or what are the problems in definitions? What remains to be understood and defined? Thank you.
Thank you. I have one more there.
My name is Rama Farmo. I work for the government, European environment.
Reflect processes. Regarding the new EU legislation on deforestation-free supply chains for selected key products, I really think that this could be a definite game changer, and very interesting to hear your thoughts on that. So my question is, what has the feedback been so far from specifically private sector and companies on these new proposal to new regulation, given the new due diligence procedures that they would have to comply with? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's just let me quickly recap the two questions from the room. The first question is for Jesse, is on the definitions, and the second question is for Helge, is what's the feedback from private sector on the proposed regulation? Okay, let me turn to Helge. Maybe first, do you want to respond to both questions raised online here in the room? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I've been also trying to type super fast to reply to the many questions in the chat. So sorry if their answers were not perfectly drafted. It's hard to listen and to type at the same time. But anyway, you are more than welcome to get in touch if you have specific questions. Then we can go into that more. On the two questions, on the feedback, I think, well, as any types of new regulation, you can imagine feedback is mixed. I mean, there are questions around how this can be implemented, whether it's too ambitious, too difficult, whatever. But there's also a lot of positive feedback. And then I think, in particular, those who already have traceability systems in place, of course, welcome this very much, because this ensures a level playing field. And that really gives them also a competitive advantage for those who have already for many years in parts been trying to clean up their supply chain and to make sure that they know where they source from, and to also ensure that where they source from is deforestation free. So also a number of, and this was really feedback from different sectors. So certainly mixed feedback, but also a lot of positive reactions from those who are already basically doing what will need to be done. On costs, we did an impact assessment regarding economic impacts and trade impacts of the regulation. We usually do not include in these impact assessments a cost assessment for implementation, because again, this is something that needs to be done at member states level. So this was not part of our official impact assessment. And then I think I tried to reply in the chat to questions around mixed products. So basically the logic being that you need to know for each of the components of your mixed products where they come from. So this will require then different traceability chains for the different components, and you need to make sure that your mixed products only contain components where you know the origin and can trace them back to the plot of land. And we will indeed provide support also through guidance documents in the implementation phase for different sectors, because it's true what was said, different sectors have different challenges. So of course we will try from our side to facilitate. The basic logic is the one I try to explain.
Great. Let me pass to Jesse for the question on definitions.
Thanks, Bo. And thank you for the question. Definitions, the big problem for Australia is, sorry, When we introduced the laws, it was novel. We were regulating a whole set of industries that we'd not regulated on this level before. So there are issues built into our legislation around things like what is actually regulated. We call it timber, but paper is not timber. So we need to redefine what timber is in our legislation so that it's fully clear to everyone what is actually being regulated without going through the full detail. We have issues around what is a domestic processor. So who are we capturing in Australia's context around who is harvesting the trees, who is processing the trees. So we're regulating them correctly. But then we have the broader issue of what is illegally logged. And we have a whole range of countries who unilaterally implemented laws that each have a slight different nuance on what is illegally logged. So in the Australian context, illegally logged is in breach of the law at point of harvest. What that fully encompasses, it's a bit clearer for us. It's around, did you have the right to cut down the tree? But there are broader questions there around labor standards. And are you ticking all of the tick boxes on sustainability, or is this purely an economic law to stop illegal trade? So one of the things that we did look at in our review, and it remains to be seen if it will be pursued, but it's in the works at the moment, is do we include in the definition of illegally logged countries that have log export bans? Now, it hasn't, that tree wasn't illegally harvested, but if they've exported a log to Australia that they were technically not allowed to under their law, should we be doing the right thing and stopping that at our border? Now, we haven't answered that question yet, but it is something we're pursuing. And so those is just a snapshot of some of those definitional issues we've got.
Thank you, Jesse. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we do have to wrap up this session today. And I know we have heard 4 great comprehensive presentations today with a lot of information and also a lot of questions. I saw a lot of, the chat is still going on online. But a few hands I heard through the day. Number one is about technology and data. Whether that's about timber testing or whether that's real analysis of import declarations or information system for due diligence statements. And the second is on definitions. We just heard what Jesse mentioned in the Australia context, the definition of illegal logging, and we also heard this is an improvement in the proposed EU regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. And the last point I want to make is another common theme here throughout the Forest Legality Week on international engagement and partnership, which I think is a good transition to our following panel. But with that, I want to wrap up the session, this session, and I want to thank all the audience, both online and in the room, as well. Special thanks to our 4 speakers today.